Our guests on today's program include a health behavior specialist who will tell us why we don't always obey our doctor's orders and don't always follow health instructions. We'll tour the Elizabeth Ball collection on display in Bracken Library and find out something we didn't know about Henry David Thoreau, the 19th century naturalist. Dr. Godfrey Hochbaum, a professor of health education at the University of North Carolina, is a health behavior specialist who talks with us today about people who ignore their doctor's orders, and he tells us why we do things like this to ourselves. Dr. Hochbaum, as a health behavior specialist, can you tell us why people behave as they do? For example, not following doctor's instructions.
Well, first of all, the not following doctor's instructions is something that every one of us has done. Every patient has done. I don't know of any patients, including physicians, who have followed the doctor's orders all the way. In fact, there is an old saying that the worst patients are physicians. They are the worst in terms of following what other physicians prescribe to them. And I think what it illustrates is what you know in your head that you ought to do is not necessarily what you really do. I think we all have had the experience. Each one of us who has been sick, and I speak from my own experience, having had a heart attack about 3 years ago, do not want a repetition. I did not want another heart attack. I knew that if I followed the doctor's orders, which meant rehabilitation, taking certain medication, losing weight, and things of that sort, might save my life or might prevent another heart attack. So I knew I should follow the doctor's order, and I'm a health professional, so I speak also from this point of view. The question was, when I went home with all the intentions of following the doctor's orders, I found that all sorts of things happened to me that prevented me. I was supposed to use less salt. Well, quite a part of the fact that I like salt on my potatoes, and I love pork chops, it was difficult to deal with this. I was not the one who purchased the food. I was not the one who cooked it. I was not the one who selected what to eat and what not to eat. So I depended on my wife, who was very cooperative. But if my wife had not been, or if my wife had not known what to do about it, she could not have helped me, and I couldn't have lived up to it. Sometimes I was a guest at someone's house, and the hostess prepared food which I knew I shouldn't eat, and I was caught in a dilemma. Should I do what the doctor told me and insult my hostess? Or at this particular moment, was it more important to me to do something to please the hostess? And at this particular moment, I wanted to please my hostess. So at this moment, I violated what the doctor told me. There are many reasons of that sort which have nothing to do with health or disease that influence people to do things which they should know they should not do. Let me give you another example. I don't know how many listening in here are smokers or are ex-smokers. If they're ex-smokers, I'm sure they quit smoking because they were afraid of getting cancer, emphysema, heart disease, and so forth. And they were well aware that if they continued smoking for the next 5, 10, 15 years, consuming thousands of cigarettes, that might lead to cancer, heart disease. We know that, and they know that. That's why they quit. But as every ex-smoker knows, after quitting, there are many, many times every day, for days, for weeks, for months, when suddenly they have that great desire for a cigarette. No, they don't want to go back to smoking. They do what the doctor told them, but they want just one cigarette, perhaps one puff of a cigarette. And at this point, they still say, I'm going to do what the doctor tells me, I will not go back to smoking. All I want is one cigarette. And the desire is very, very great. So they succumb to that need, and they smoke that one cigarette. But the same thing happened again and again and again, and all of a sudden they are back to smoking. Now what it illustrates that no matter how much we are motivated to follow doctor's orders, that every single time when we have to choose, should I or should I not take the medication, should I or should I not smoke that cigarette, things happen at this particular moment and we violate this own thing.
In your studies of human behavior, in respect to health, have you any recommendations that could improve our acceptance of following doctor's orders and taking care of ourselves?
Yes. What we usually do, whether we are physicians or nurses or whatever, we try to teach the patient what to do. Or even healthy people, we try to teach people that they should be physically active, they should control their stress, they should maintain certain rules of good nutrition. We teach them the knowledge, and we try to motivate them by telling them how important it is. But we don't pay attention to helping them cope with situations like I described, how to deal with the situations. So for example, in the program which I have at the University of North Carolina, we train our students to work with patients and other people and say, what do you think could happen tomorrow or day after tomorrow that might prevent you from doing what the doctor tells you? And then how can you cope with this? How can you prevent it? How can you avoid smoking that one cigarette? When you are a guest at some houses, how can you deal with the situation where you have no free choice? So in other words, coming down realistically, we have to help people avoid making mistakes and filling up the realistic conditions at that particular time.
It's also a matter of priorities, is it not?
Oh yes. Well, I try to make a distinction between what is important to a person and what is urgent to the person. For instance, I know it's very important for me not to be stressful. Tomorrow morning I'm supposed to take a plane to go back to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Well, tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and I have to get ready to leave for the plane. At that particular moment, I'm not going to think about heart disease or cancer or arthritis or diabetes. Tomorrow morning I'm going to think about making the plane.
And that's a form of stress to you.
That's a stress to me. I know it, but it's so urgent. If I didn't undertake this, if I did not suffer that stress, I missed the plane. So what I have to find out, someone has to help me in a situation like this, no matter how urgent it is to get the plane. Can I cope with it in a way that will be less stress producing?
At your Ball State lectures, you address stress management. Are people beginning to learn how to deal with stress? And by stress, there are good forms and bad forms. Is that not true? But how do you teach people to deal with it?
Well, I think we tend to think of stress as something bad, as you noticed it. But stress is also the kind of force that makes us creative. You can't climb a mountain, you can't write a book, you can't make a great new invention without stress. It is the thing that drives us on. So stress can be good. Stress becomes destructive when we cannot perform, cannot cope with it. The trouble with stress management is that many programs, instead of dealing with what causes the stress, deal with how can you manage. And so we have breathing exercises. We tell people to take cold showers. We tell people to meditate. All of these are, I think, band-aids put on stress. They do not deal with the cause of stress. I'd like to give you an example. I'm engaged in some very large research with the rubber industry. We're dealing with rubber workers. And one of the things we're doing is helping them cope with stress. Well, as you know and everyone knows, right now many of the rubber plants are closing and laying off workers. And that produces a great deal of stress among workers. They are faced with, maybe tomorrow I don't have a job. How am I going to feed my children? How am I going to find another job? It's great stress. Some stress management program would come in and tell them to lie down, relax, and everything else. What we are trying to do is identify and deal with the causes of the stress, which is the fear of unemployment. So our stress management would be to help these people learn how they can find another job, to help them ways of training for a different kind of career. This is the way to reduce stress.
Breathing exercises won't help these people.
No, breathing exercises are very useful, and meditation is very useful. It's very useful to calm down at the time being, but it does not, it's like taking aspirin for a toothache, but it doesn't remove the carie in the tooth. You go to the dentist to have the tooth taken care of.
Dr. Bruce Kirkham, Ball State Professor of English, has written the introduction to a booklet, A Garland for Elizabeth Ball, for the exhibit of the Elizabeth Ball collection in the Ball State Bracken Library Special Collections. He takes us on a tour of these interesting artifacts. Dr. Kirkham, tell us about A Garland for Elizabeth Ball, about the catalog which I understand you wrote, including the introduction.
Yes, the special collection staff here in Bracken and I put together a sampling from the works that had been given to the university by the George and Frances Ball Foundation in about 1984 to attempt to honor not only Miss Elizabeth Ball, but to give, through the selection of the items, some indication of the breadth of her interest, of the variety of the collection, which is a significant contribution to the library here at Ball State.
How many items are in the collection?
Here we've sampled just 27. I don't really know offhand. It's several hundred, certainly.
Will they be available for research?
Everything that's in the library is available for research to qualified persons.
Let's take a look at probably one of the best-known items, and that's a page from the Gutenberg Bible.
One of the most interesting items in the selection, I think, or one that most people think of when they think of a rare book, is the Gutenberg Bible, and we're fortunate to have a single page from one copy of the first Bible printed by movable type in English. There were only 200 to 300 copies printed. 47 have survived, and not all of them are perfect. And the pages that you'll find in collections such as this are taken from those imperfect copies. A page here, a page there, so that many people in many collections around the country, around the world, can experience the pleasure of looking at a page from the first Bible printed by movable type.
And this dates from the 15th century?
Yes, 1454 to 55. This selection is from Hosea chapter 8.
What is the significance of the Chains book?
This is a book printed in Argentina in 1506. And what's significant about it is that, as you notice, this isn't too far after the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. And books were rare enough so that they had to be protected from theft. Now we have various security systems in libraries. But at that time, they took a very effective but primitive means of chaining the book to a ring, either that ran along a bar across the top of the reading table or to the reading table itself, and therefore you couldn't take the book out because it was chained down. That's also why these little metal pieces are on the outside. That protects the book when it lies on the counter. As you see, they've been there for a long time.
How are these horn books used?
These were used to instruct children in their ABCs. As early as the 15th century, educators recognized the desirability of using printing as a device to teach reading and writing to children. But paper was still scarce, and paper was valuable, and printing was costly. So what they did was to print the ABCs and brief prayers, usually, on a single piece of paper, and then to protect it from the grubby little hands of the children, put it behind a piece of horn, cow's horn, sliced very thin to protect it, and staple it to a wooden paddle. The idea carries over in later works. This is a lovely one painted on ivory, and this is a brass horn book. Technically a horn book, I suppose, although the ring at the top suggests perhaps it was more decorative than functional.
Do miniature books like these three in the Elizabeth Ball collection serve a purpose?
If nothing else, they show the response to the challenge that movable type presented to printers. We saw initially the page of the Gutenberg was very large. Very soon printers said, if we can print big, maybe we can print small. And as early as 1475, they were producing books of this size, or even smaller. These are 20th century, produced calligraphically, but this one, the Lady of Shalott, is 1.5 inches by 1 3/8 inches. Surely a testament to the technical achievement of printing to print that small.
And there's one, the Odes of Keats.
Yes, the Odes of Keats and the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.
Speaking of Keats, let's take a look at a very lovely book. This appears to be a first edition of Keats' work.
Yes, this is the first edition of Lamia and Isabella, published in 1820. We have another copy in the collection, so the joy in having this is not that we now have a first edition of this book, but because this book represents a certain kind of, a certain attitude toward books and collectors. This is a book that was highly treasured by someone who took the first edition and rebound it using amethyst and turquoise in the cover, a lot of gold and lovely leather, and then affixed inside a miniature portrait of Keats painted on ivory and bound it into the cover. A lovely example of a lovely 19th century binding, perhaps a tad overdone, but then the Victorians were not ones for restraint. The books in this case, as we've tried to do throughout the collection, reflect the interests of Elizabeth Ball. The Tempest is a quarto of Shakespeare's last play and reflects her interest in drama. The other book is a first edition of Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and She Was a Traveler. On the left-hand upper corner are Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, written for children, reflecting her interest in children and children's books. Next to it, one of the first publications of Robert Burns' poems. Down in the lower left-hand corner, Shelley's elegy on Keats, and she was a poet in her own right, thus 2 volumes of poetry. And then in the lower right-hand corner, a first edition of Charles Dickens' Bleak House.
Didn't Miss Ball have a great interest in nature?
She took degrees in botany at Buffalo Seminary and then at Vassar. We felt it appropriate then in this garland for Elizabeth Ball to feature books with flowers in them. Flowers are a very important part of her life, both in her books and in her home on Minnetrista Boulevard. People are perhaps unaware that all those crocuses in the woods around her house were not there naturally. She went out and had them planted and took great pride in them every spring.
These books are early.
Yes, 18th century mostly.
This is an exhibit in special collections that people should see, and it will be up through the middle of June.
Right. It's, we have more cases like this. There are 27 books in the exhibit. The catalog is available to anyone who comes in free of charge, describing all the books in the exhibit and a little essay in it about Miss Ball. We're open every day from 8 to 5, 5 days a week, and Wednesday night from 7:30 to 9:30. And the courteous attendant staff who's helped me put this exhibit together will be here to answer your questions and help you. I would encourage everyone to come.
And we always have an interesting exhibit here in special collections.
Year-round.
Dr. Francis Dedman, Catawba College, Salisbury, North Carolina, has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Henry David Thoreau. Dr. Dedman shares some of the little-known facts about this 19th century American environmentalist. Dr. Dedman, could you identify Thoreau for us, what he was like, what he did, and what he accomplished in his own lifetime?
Well, he was a native of Concord, Massachusetts, very proud of it, felt that it was the center of the universe, and really he wanted to go no other place. He wanted to know Concord, he wanted to know all about it, he wanted to know the woods, he wanted to know the people, but he wanted to stay right there. Graduate of Harvard, protege of Emerson's, and a nature lover, nature writer, loved the woods, loved the fields, and spent his life, the whole life, except for some time he spent in New York and a few other places temporarily, there in Concord. And so he is sometimes referred to as the man of Concord.
And one of our first environmentalists.
One of our first environmentalists, although he himself at times was accused of disturbing the environment. He and a friend of his were out cooking, opened fire out in the woods and set the woods on fire. And the people in Concord for years never forgave him. And so they referred to him derisively as the man that set the woods on fire. But anyone may create a fire sometime when we don't expect to. But yes, he was a great environmentalist, a lover of nature, preserver of nature, felt he knew the scientific name of every plant that he discovered in his nature walks around Concord.
Have his theories stood the test of time?
Some of his theories have been very influential and have stood the test of time very well. For example, he is generally accredited with being the father of the notion of nonviolent resistance, what he calls resistance to civil government.
You're talking about what year now? The mid-19th century?
Yes. Thoreau, of course, was born in 1817 and died in 1862. So we're talking about the mid-years. He was during his mature years, were in the mid-50s, 1850s. He had a great influence on Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi said that he picked up his idea of nonviolent resistance from Thoreau and applied it in India, and ultimately broke the back of the British power in India. Martin Luther King, for example, says Thoreau provided for him the idea of nonviolence, the example, the model for nonviolence, and there are other leaders in reform who at least say Thoreau had a great influence on them. Particularly as nonviolence, the idea of nonviolence.
What led him to this idea, and was it practiced in his lifetime?
I don't know that it was practiced in his lifetime. I think it was an idea that came to him that he thought would be the way to go. He came to the idea because he felt this was the way to break the power of slavery. He was violently against slavery. And he did not believe that, or did believe, that men of principle, taking a stand, a nonviolent stand, could ultimately correct, change any system that they found themselves in if they stood upon principle. Now, Thoreau, however, did approve of what John Brown did at Harper's Ferry, which was a violent act, not a nonviolent act, but Thoreau justified that by saying that John Brown was a man of principle, for Thoreau called him a golden man.
What did John Brown do?
John Brown led the raid, he and a group of his followers on Harper's Ferry, and they were going to seize guns and so on at Harper's Ferry, and then really set the slaves free. They were going to cause an uprising and set the slaves free in a violent way.
And he was hung for that act.
But Thoreau, yes, he was hung for that act, and Thoreau made speech after speech when John Brown was the day on which he was executed, and in that time period, proclaiming the glories of John Brown, which came at the end of Thoreau's life. Thoreau died in 1862, and the John Brown episode came a few years before that.
Was Thoreau respected and recognized for his great ability during his lifetime?
Not during his own lifetime. In fact, he was rather derided in many quarters. James Russell Lowell, even Emerson in the eulogy that he delivered and then published in the Atlantic Monthly, called Thoreau a skulker, called him a man without ambition. So Thoreau was not appreciated in his own day. Walden, the book Walden, for example, was published in 1854. Thoreau lived 8 years after that, and the 2,000-volume edition of Walden lasted for the rest of Thoreau's life. Now, since that time, however, we estimate that there have been something like 200 editions of Walden, some of which have run to 500,000 copies. But in Thoreau's own day, he was not read widely, and he was not really respected. That is, by the popular, by people in general. Well, of course, he had some close friends, particularly a man named Ellery Channing, who did appreciate him, but Thoreau was not appreciated widely in his own day.
You mentioned him being Ralph Waldo Emerson's protege.
Right.
Did he and Emerson, because he was derided, you said, after he died by Emerson, did they have a falling out?
Yes. Well, some of us were discussing this last night. Falling out may be a slightly strong term, but at least there was a cooling of their relationship. After 1850, Thoreau and Emerson drifted apart. Thoreau did become somewhat critical, in a mild way, but critical of Emerson. Thoreau turned to other people such as Ellery Channing, and Thoreau and Emerson drifted apart. They were very close up until about 1850. And from that point on, the rest of Thoreau's life, they were ostensibly friends, and they didn't leave town when one came to town and that type of thing. But nevertheless, they were not close. And some of the biographers, particularly of Emerson, would have it that there was a great deal, or there was at least some enmity between them that really drove a wedge between them, kept them apart.
What do you believe has been Thoreau's influence on the arts and humanities?
Well, his influence on the arts and the humanities has mainly been a secondary one of inspiration. Thoreau was, of course, a naturalist. He praised nature highly. He loved nature. There have been those who have taken some inspiration from his love of nature and have tried to capture it in a graphic sense. In other words, artists have been influenced to try to impart some of Thoreau's enthusiasm for nature, which he described in words in art.
Then you feel that he's made a great impact on the environment, social problems, and ethical living?
He's made a great influence. Yes, he's had a great influence in all of those areas, and I think particularly so in the ethical one. There we see evidences of his influence more today. I mentioned, for example, Dr. King, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, the leaders, some of the leaders in the apartheid movement in South Africa have said that Thoreau gave them real inspiration to keep on. They're still attempting to break the apartheid situation in South Africa in a nonviolent way.
This is perhaps his greatest contribution.
I think it's his greatest, the most enduring contribution, yes. I think it's the most enduring one.